Lord John Browne, welcome to Crazy Money.
Thank you.
Lord Browne, will you take me back to early 2007? How is your professional life going?
Well, my professional life was going fine. BP had recovered from an accident at Texas City 2 years previously. Profits were in good shape. The company was doing well, and the renewable energy business, a leading indicator of what to do because things had to change with carbon dioxide, was developing. My private life was in a very different position. I had been a gay man, I was a gay man, in the closet for a very long time. I was getting up 60 years old and just 59 actually, 59 years old. And I wanted to stay in the closet for reasons that we can go into. But in May 2007, I had tried to bottle up with a series of injunctions a story which a previous boyfriend of mine had sold to the Daily Mail group. And I failed. It came out. It was a scandal of power, politics, lies, all the things that newspapers like. And I concluded at that moment that I had to resign from BP because I would have become a campaign by the newspaper, and that would be no good for me and no good for the company. It was the wrong thing to do. So I resigned without asking whether I should or shouldn't. And on May the 1st, I think May the 1st, I walked out of the front door of BP. And that concluded my entire career in BP. I walked out to the throngs of the global press, who then chased me for 3 days on motorbikes and long telephoto lenses, and kept me well tucked away in my apartment in London, where they were besieged outside. And after 3 days, as the saying goes, I became tomorrow's fish and chips. The newspapers were used to wrap up fish and chips.
What did it feel like to wake up the day after the story broke?
I think in order to answer that question, I should go back and tell you why I was in the closet this long. So I was born in the 40s. For those who've seen the latest TV drama, It's a Sin, if they thought that was a very a portrayal of bigotry and prejudice against gay people in the 80s, they should try the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Boys' school in the 50s in England wasn't a very welcoming place, I assume.
No. I mean, the whole atmosphere was a very homophobic atmosphere, very homophobic indeed. And of course, until I was at university, it was actually illegal to be gay and do something about it. To go and have sex with another man could end you up in jail, and it may well end you up in the hands of a blackmailer who said, well, we could send you to jail. And so the atmosphere was terrible. So that was one reason I stayed in the closet. The other one was my mother, who had been through and survived the Holocaust. She was in Auschwitz, kept banging on at me saying, remember, never tell anyone a secret because they will surely use it against you. And then she also would remind me, never be an identifiable member of a minority, because when the going gets tough, the majority always hurt the minority. Mm. These are two important and probably enduring values or enduring bits of advice. So that combined with the overall environment said, stay in the closet, throw away the key and stay there. And I did. And I believe that if I stayed in the closet, then I would be safe. And if I came out, I'd be unsafe. I, of course, ran two lives, a public life and a deeply private life, which I tried to hide away, which was fine, when nobody knew who I was. And as time went on, of course, more people knew who I was than I knew who they were.
Right.
And so it became more dangerous. You know, how do you know that someone you're with isn't going to sell your story to the Daily Mail or tell everybody about you? Could threaten your job, could do all sorts of things. So I think I did learn about how to read people pretty quickly, but I kept a very deeply held secret life and a public life where I was effectively asexual. And I believe firmly that if I were known to be gay, I'd lose all my friends, I'd lose all my respect, I'd lose all my business capability, I may well be eased out of the company, eased out of everything. So I stayed there, probably stayed there longer than I realized that was necessary. The reason is that I'd convinced myself about the appropriateness of what I was doing. What I hadn't recognized is the world was changing after the 90s. And I didn't realize that. I didn't notice. And I assumed everything was the same. It was very interesting. When I came out, I then thought all those things. The day after I came out, I said, I've lost all my friends. I'm losing all my business contacts. I have nothing and I will start again somehow. I'm pretty resilient. Only to find that I was flooded with emails of support and letters of support. In those days, people wrote genuine letters and they came to the letterbox, and phone calls from all sorts of people. Remarkable. So that was a moment of great realization that maybe I'd read this wrong, and actually people weren't rejecting me. Actually, after 3 days of hiding away from the paparazzi, my apartment was in Chelsea. I walked out to the King's Road to do some necessary shopping. And what was surprising was the number of people who stopped me to shake my hand and say, we're right behind you. Well done. Good for you. And I thought to myself, gosh, this is remarkable. Actually, it was something I basically broke down. I couldn't control myself after that. And so I did a little shopping, went home and thought about it all. And I thought about it and said, well, I've just got to start again and let's see what happens. And remarkable things happened. I made a whole lot of new friends. My old friends treated me differently with great respect and wanted to know about, what I could do to make it easier to come out, people to come out. I met the partner that I still have after all these years. And the list of things went on. I changed all my business activities. I got rid of many of the appointments that I had and started again. So I had a second life.
You resigned from some boards, or were allowed to, or were asked to, politely asked, not come.
I think the word was politely asked, but made it possible for me. There's always, in those days when you were on boards, you had to, and still the case actually in many boards, if you changed your principal employment, you had to reapply to stay on the board. And that gave plenty of people a reason to say, well, actually, you're no longer CEO of BP, so why don't you leave? That's what happened.
But there were some boards that wouldn't hear of you resigning. What was the makeup, or what was the attitude of the people on those boards of the organizations that would be consistent, that allowed them to see the bigger picture there?
Well, I think they need a lot of confidence, and I think they need to feel independent. I think a lot of boards, a lot of people, a lot of organizations, and I saw this incidentally when I was interviewing people to write my book, The Glass Closet. A lot of people say, well, we really can't have gay people on the board or gay people selling our products because our clients might not like it. Our clients might not like it. Now, they may not like it either, but they transfer the responsibility to clients, customers. The boards of people who have very independently minded directors, confident to say, well, if they don't like us, we don't like them, then they say, what's wrong? You will stay. And I was quite struck by, for example, the Royal Academy of Engineering, very prestigious, a National Academy of Learning in the UK. I suggested I resigned, and the trustees instantly came back after having had a meeting to say, you cannot possibly do that. You must stay. This has got nothing to do with your capability as president and everything to do with the meaning of diversity. So I really have been eternally grateful for people like that who show some strength of character and commitment to a set of values that they actually use in practice. And those have stuck with me. And it was one of the reasons I was eventually persuaded to write this book, The Glass Closet, why coming out was good business. I was quite reluctant to do it until one of my friends who was the publisher at Penguin Random House at the time, said, you need to do this. You really need to do this, because if it helps one person, it's a good job done. So I said, well, I'll talk about my story, but I'll go and ask a lot of people what they think too. And that's what I did. And my striking point is how when people were consistent with their values, employers, organizations, how these decisions about diversity and inclusion were easier to make. They stood by this key point that it's about human rights. It's about the values of an organization. It's about values of an individual. It's about their rights to be individual wherever they are and to be themselves. And that's, to my mind, a very important thing to remember about the LGBT plus, can I say, community group of people, that they have equal rights to other people.
Well, I know I'm not the target market that you're trying to help necessarily, but I can tell you that it certainly helped me see and understand the world a little bit better. So I appreciate you writing the book. And one of the things that it opened my eyes to was the cost that homophobia imposes on business. Any new employee to a McKinsey or a Bain has to answer a case interview question. So I've got a case interview question for you, Lord Browne. If you were to calculate the global economic cost of homophobia, how would you go about doing that?
I'd simply take 1 to 2% of total returns from the corporate sector and say that's probably the cost. It's huge.
How do you arrive at that number?
Well, a lot of these long-term academic studies seem to indicate that profits rise by 2%, 2 absolute percent, profit margin by 2 absolute percent, if inclusion is a key plank of a company's life. And it's like this, it's about teamwork. And I think that most companies would agree, and most leaders would agree, that to engage their staff in a team deeply to the purpose of what's going on, and for everyone to believe they're a member of that team, creates a far better result. In fact, studies show that the higher the engagement, the higher the profit. The reverse is also true, that if people think that they're threatened as team members, maybe because they're in the closet and nobody's quite sure who they are, and when people say, why don't you bring your wife? And there's a gay man who says, well, actually, I don't have a wife. What they have to say is, I'll be delighted to bring my husband. A gay woman can say, I'll be delighted to bring my wife, or friend. But if you can't do that, then you feel there's a barrier between you and the team. and it changes the dynamic. Somehow, business has this big social side to it. I don't mean having tea and coffee and gossiping. It's about being part of society. And there are groups of people called teams that really have to rely on one another and bring themselves to the workplace as they really are. And if they don't do that, engagement's down, profits are down. So that's how I come up with my 1 to 2%.
You started your career, one of your early posts in your career was in 1969 in an oil field 650 miles north of Anchorage, above the Arctic Circle. This couldn't have been an ally-rich environment at the time. Did you fit in with the other guys? What was that like?
Well, I kind of did, because I was, first of all, I was actually the youngest person there. I was I think, one of the few Brits. There were a few Brits. And we worked 2 weeks, what they call 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So 2 weeks in Anchorage, Alaska, and 2 weeks close to Point Barrow, above the Arctic Circle, doing field work.
Anchorage, Anchorage was the sunny break
Oh,
from.
absolutely. Well, I do remember one of them. There are two things that stick with me. Number one is when it was dark and cold, which was half the year, and it was always cold, but it was deeply cold. You had to dress up with Arctic parka and balaclava, everything. And you froze like a statue, because instantly it was like being freeze-dried. You just instantly froze, and you had to sort of keep banging yourself to be able to move around. And this was a pretty scary thing to do. And you mustn't touch metal with bare hands because you'd leave your hand behind, all sorts of things like that. Secondly, I remember the cabins being steam heated. So it did make people slightly damp when they went out. But the most important piece of entertainment was eating very sweet donuts. And for the first time in my life, I gained about, I should think, 10 kilos, I think, in my time there. Anyway, it quickly went, but it was one of the things that you did on the North Slope, eat donuts. You know, and there are American donuts, of course, with plenty of colors and lots of very vivid colors indeed. They're not like donuts you get in Europe.
But the point in asking that was, for 40 years in a very male-dominated industry, you couldn't bring your entire self to work. And in fact, you had to take extra efforts, emotional, logistical, to keep your identity hidden. How much of a cost did that impose on you emotionally and physically?
Well, it's very difficult to say. It certainly was a constant way of life. It was hardly an anxiety. It was, I trained myself to behave this way.
Like like a spy, you said.
It was almost like James Bond, you know, with two identities. One is a public identity. So that was John Browne, the person in the oil business, you know, correctly dressed, correctly behaved, confirmed bachelor, or at least no one identified whether I had a girlfriend. And then in a very deep secret life, John Browne, the gay person who wanted no one to know who he was. And I kept these two things quite separate. And it became almost a way of life. It was the second nature. And that was easier, and it was kind of fun actually when I was young. But it's easier so long as no one knows who you are. The moment someone knows who you are, the risk factors go up. And so while what I did learn is how to read people, so very quickly assess what they were thinking, who they were, what they were going to do, in the end, the risks are still there. And it's fine while people don't know who you are. It really is a problem when they do know who you are. And you have to go deeper and deeper into a secret life. And that's why I ended up actually making a boyfriend of an escort that I'd got, because that was the only way I could find people. It wasn't an excuse, it's just the way I decided to do things. And that caused the whole problem. I mean, he sold a story to a newspaper. I signed one of the witness statements that I signed contained an untrue fact. And for that, I corrected it within 10 days, but it was too late. I'd done something wrong, and I've been pushed into a corner to do that. So it was a terrible error of judgment. It was a terrible error of judgment to become the boyfriend of an escort. So it was a terrible error of judgment to expose him to some of my life. So he could write he could tell lots and lots of quite extraordinary stories.
You mentioned in the book several times that you should have come out earlier in your career, but at a certain point, you reach a level of responsibility where you are the representative of tens of thousands of people doing business all over the world in some of the most politically and religiously conservative planets in some of the most politically and religiously conservative societies on the planet. It seems like, well, at a certain point, it's too late to do that.
It is. I think I speak for myself. I invested a lot of time and energy in constructing the house which I was living in, which had these two lives, and I'd got used to it. And actually, I was being consistent with myself, continuing to carry on as John Browne, the public figure, John Browne, the secret figure. I carried on way beyond when it was realistic so to do. Actually, when I wrote my book, I took it to a literary festival. Guy got up to the audience at the Q&A session, said, I'm a 40-year-old man, said, I'm in the oil business. I used to work for a competitor. And I have to tell you that we all knew you were gay. The only problem was none of us were brave enough to come and tell you you were gay. Mm. And I thought in that one statement, it summarized everything. You know, we were all playing our role. I was playing a role, and everyone kind of knew what role that was. No one said, and we carried on until it just blew up.
So is it hard to, when you're the CEO of such a large company, to get people around you who will be brutally honest with you?
They're very honest with you on business. I think my team was deeply honest and quite brutally honest on business strategy, operations, appointments. But there are some places people don't go. And actually, they were all men, incidentally. Mm. I often think to myself, if I had a 50-50 gender balance, whether actually someone would have come up and said, hey, John, look, let's just talk about this because it's fine. And we really want to help you through this. And I think that actually all men in a place probably behave, well, they do. They behave very differently from a proper mix of genders. There's no doubt about that.
You know, one of the things that struck me in this book is that this happened only 13 years ago. That this is really close to where we are today. And yet we've made a lot of progress. But I think as importantly to be aware of is that we all kind of congratulate ourselves for the progress that we've made as a society. But there are still, and this is an eye-opening part of the book, and I'm reading it as I'm flying to Kenya, by the way, for a vacation or a holiday over the holidays. And it reminded me that there are still dozens of countries on earth where homosexuality is illegal, including 10 or 11 where it's punishable by death. So this is a grave situation for the leader of a company. And to say in retrospect that, well, he should have just come out is a gross misunderstanding of the situation.
I think coming out is a very personal thing. It's different for every single person. That's the most important thing. There's no one size fits all. I think to come out, you have to feel safe about your environment, and you have to think it through. Now, a lot of people, I remember when I was writing the book, I'd meet people, they say, well, everyone in my company should come out. You say, really? Uganda, what about that? Should you come out? Because if you do, even inside the office, when you leave the office, you're going to get beaten up. You might even be killed.
Right.
Is that responsible? Is that safe practice for a leader with their staff? No. So safety first is really important here, I think. So that's, I think what you have to do is make it possible for people to come out, and you have to be careful in places where they cannot come out. And you should discuss it with people. I remember, if you send people, there was a statement I made saying, well, I'm very happy to send gay people to Russia, but I want them to understand what the consequences of this are, and that they need to behave within the rules and laws of Russia, not within the rules and laws of the UK or the US. So while they're there, they have to be very disciplined, very cautious, very careful. The Russian government complained against that statement, saying I was meddling with their internal affairs. I wasn't quite sure. I was just making sure that people understood when you're in a country, you're a guest, and one person cannot change the mores or the customs or the laws of the country. The CEOs can try, they just give a little pressure to the nation's government. If it's intolerable, where people are persecuted, then you have to choose whether you're going to do business there or not, and that's a tough choice, but you have to make it.
Which brings me to an interesting point, or what I consider to be interesting. We'll find out if you and the listeners do. But it dawned on me as I was reading your book, Beyond Business, that when I go to the gas station, I put my credit card in, I pull the handle, and my car magically fills up with gas. It's simple. And yet, getting fossil fuels out of the ground is, to say that it's highly complex and capital intensive would be a gross understatement. So, using the Cusiana field in Colombia as an example, can you describe some of the technical and political and societal externalities that you're dealing with when you begin a project?
So we in 1989, BP discovered an indication that there might be quite a big oil field in the middle of the Llanos foothills in Colombia, at a time when Colombia was racked with narco-terrorism. And it was unsafe really for people to walk around anywhere because you might well, certainly if someone looked like a foreigner, you'd be kidnapped and ransomed. However, the oil field which was being discovered was a supergiant oil field. And so we concluded that we could try and develop it, and we would have to take appropriate precautions. There were hundreds of things to do. And most of them really started with the relationship we had with the locality. People were very concerned that we were using their land without compensating, because that had happened in the past with governments and big business and things like that. They didn't like that. The government had lots of environmental laws that were in place and never been enforced, and they were suddenly being enforced, and we weren't quite sure where we were at any one time. We managed to get through that. Then we had to protect our staff against guerrilla, and that required us to think about how we do that. Meanwhile, the government said, well, why don't we use the army? And I said, we don't do that sort of thing. They said, well, could we perhaps, we'll put the army around, but you have to pay for the barracks. And so we agreed to that. And then, of course, they asked for night vision, binoculars and helicopters. And we said, no, that's legal force. That's too much force. We don't do lethal force activity. The list went on and on. So eventually we built this oil field, and we it was inside a high security perimeter. The company lived inside a barricade in the Llanos. And meanwhile, we barricaded all our people in. We had to deal with and make a relationship with the communities around us. So we had a contradiction in terms. On the one hand, we said, we're open for business, come and talk to us. On the other hand, no one can get in because we had a high security fence around us. So we had to build our relationships in a very complex way, building relationships to get the right workers, to get the right hearts and minds, to actually make sure that people, when we paid them, were allowed to keep the money and not some Mr. Big took it away from them.
Right.
So we learned a lot. We learned a lot about more about how to be a part of a country which was in great difficulty, how to build relationships with what are now called all stakeholders. Meanwhile, the technical challenges were quite tricky. We had to build a huge pipeline from the middle of Colombia to the coast at Cartagena, and we had to drill oil wells through very complex terrain and complex geology to make all this work. We managed to do it in the end. It's one of many challenges like that, whether it is working with different communities in Papua, trying to understand their historic land rights and how not to abuse them, how to work with them, how to stop people deforesting around an activity that we were doing, or overfish the bay that we were using as a port, or whether, in the case of building the oil fields in Azerbaijan, in the historic sites that originally had oil in Baku a long, long time ago. These were offshore fields which still are producing. How to do that in a post-Soviet era, very close post-Soviet era, and build a pipeline through Georgia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey at a time when there was a lot of turmoil everywhere. So maintaining relationships, understanding the politics, understanding the geopolitics, understanding how to be part of a community, as well as the engineering challenges of thousands of miles of pipeline, lots of problems with drilling wells offshore, building offshore platforms in places which hadn't built offshore platforms like that they built some, but not quite the ones we wanted for a very long time. So these are just the complexities of the oil business, and it doesn't always go right. So you have to remember that you've got to correct yourself, learn, and surround yourself, yourself being the company, surround yourself with people who really know what they're talking about.
What do you wish critics of the oil industry appreciated more fully? And what do you think the oil industry should be doing to continue to improve their role as global citizens?
So I have no doubt that the oil and gas industry were far too late to come to the table to do something about climate change. In 1997, I stood up at one of my alma maters at Stanford University and said, we have a problem with the climate. There's a real problem with the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere. This was a long time ago now. And the oil industry is at fault and we must do something about it. So I committed BP to doing something about it. They were small steps to start with. We had targets, we met them. The rest of the oil industry really didn't come along. In fact, the American Petroleum Institute were very negative. They said, well, BP's just left the church, whatever that meant. So they were late coming to the table. And I think that is the very big problem that they created for themselves. They divided themselves from the society of which they are part. And it's better to actually be around a table with people who want to do something and be constructive about trying to reduce carbon dioxide than saying, well, it's not a problem, which they used to do for a long time. So that set them back a long way. I think most people know that we're going to have to use hydrocarbons of one form or another for quite a long time. The question is how much? And I think that's the big debate. Right now, I would say that the oil industry has to think about its role. It's going to be different from the past. The past is not an indicator of the future. They will be needed, or put it like this, at least oil and gas will be needed. Who provides it remains to be seen. But the vast bulk of all the growth in the world, the growth of energy and the replacement of some of the dirty hydrocarbons, all of that's a brand new industry, huge, huge new industry, which is transforming the way in which we live so that we can get down to net zero carbon emissions. And the oil industry can either be part of it or they will be pushed to one side. There is no doubt about that now.
Do you drive an electric car?
I do, actually. It's just outside the window. I will confess, I drive two cars. One car I haven't driven for a year. I think it's still okay. It's a gasoline petrol car. It's in a garage, and it may never come out of the garage again. Who knows? The other one is an electric car. It's a very small, it's a Volkswagen electric car. It's 2 years old, which means it's kind of out of date already. But no, that's used around town. So I have been involved with changing the energy mix for a long time. Been running one of the world's biggest renewable energy funds. I'm still heavily involved in it. I'm an investor, I'm a private investor in plenty of companies that are trying to do just that, change the energy mix to low carbon, zero carbon energy mix.
What accomplishments at BP are you most proud of?
I think not too many. One is the speech I made in 1997 at Stanford. Which I think began to change the way in which oil and gas companies were going to behave, and what has changed the way in which they are now behaving in regard to net zero.
I'm not going to interrupt you, but do you think that speech put a target on you that wasn't helpful as your career became more controversial later on?
Yes, definitely. But when you stand up and say something, I guess, if you don't want to have a target, you better keep your head down.
Right.
And so, yes, indeed, it did that. Secondly, I think probably another thing that put a target on me was the creation of a super major, where I believe the economies of scale and getting the best of the best from many companies together. I started that trend by merging with Amoco in 1999. And I think the third thing is BP's attitude towards diversity and inclusion. The work was no means finished, but I would argue that people's attitudes towards equality, inclusion, diversity is never finished. And I think that we began to make some good strides, improving the gender balance of management, which is very important, beginning to open up senior positions to people who were not Anglo-American, but from all parts of the world. And those were important steps. I remember giving a speech on this in the early 90s, in the early 2000s, excuse me, to, I think, a conference in Berlin, it was, where I made a statement that BP was going to offer same-sex partners equal access to benefits, because it was good for access to talent and improving the way in which BP would therefore recruit around the world. So the very next day, The Guardian, I think, ran a headline on, I think, page 3, which said, BP chief to recruit gays.
Of course. How else would you report that?
And that certainly sent a shiver down my spine. But actually, it was, I think, the beginning. That was really the beginning of a slight realization that things were changing. I do think, we've come a long way. I always say the glass is definitely half full, but not fully full. to keep it at least half full, we have to have constant vigilance because it's so easy to slip back. It's so easy for bigots to be in the ascendancy. And we must do everything to stop that, because it's not just LGBT plus, it's not just trans, it's not just gender, it's not just race, it's all of it combined. And when one slips, everything slips, in my view. We have to remember this is, how people are is an intrinsic human right, the right to be who you are and not to have to conform to someone else's idea of who you might be. That's a great right, and we should fight very hard for that.
And that right is actually very consistent with doing good business.
It absolutely is. Good business is about doing business not just today, but doing it for a long time and doing it to have impact as well as profit. It's really important to do something which is worthwhile. In the end, great companies do something worthwhile. They produce, sometimes maybe people will trivialize it, but they do actually produce a better product, a better mousetrap, a better product. And they do it again and again. And people, therefore, and humanity, therefore, improves on the basis of that. And in order to do it again and again, they need to be part of the society in which they exist and from whom they get permission to do what they are doing. Remember, being a company is a privilege. You get certain rights, and in exchange for that, you need to be reflecting society as a whole. So you should do things. You must do things if you're going to survive for the long term and do one good thing after another. You have to do things in line with what your stakeholders expect and do them consistently and correctly.
I'm going to close in just a second, but is there any place you would like people to find out more about you, a website or your Twitter feed or anything like that?
Well, I have a Twitter feed. I have a set of books, 5 books, which I've written. The latest one, Make, Think, Imagine, which is about the primacy of innovation and engineering in the development of society. It talks about a lot of things. And there's my charity website as well, John Browne Charitable Trust. And that's, I've forgotten what it's, we can provide you with the detailed handles and names.
Let me ask you about your latest book more officially so that you can say what you just said, and then I'll ask you to close, and we will put a link to the charity website in the show notes.
Great.
Lord Browne, will you tell me about your new book?
So my new book, which came out just last year, it's called Make, Think, Imagine, and it's about civilization. It's about how civilizations developed through innovation and actually engineering, which sets at the center between discovery and commerce and humanity. And it's great to discover things, but you have to make something of them. And the more you make of them, people think about things. And the more they think, they imagine a great future. And I do think that the future of every nation is written in a book called Research and Engineering and Commerce. And getting those 3 things working together is a great challenge for all of us. And that's what the book's about. Full of interesting stories. At least I thought they were interesting. So I hope other people find them interesting.
Well, I'm sure they are, as I've read 2 of your other books, and they're fascinating stories as well. Lord John Browne, thank you so much for joining us. I've learned a whole lot from you, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Paul.